things that would have been nice to be able to show you, but it's okay. Hello. Uh, Thank you. Thank you. For those of you who don't know why people are welcoming me back, I think most of you know that I returned from Israel yesterday morning. So I'm a little bit jet lagged and also readjusting to reality. I also got off of the plane and had been texted by a reporter who said he'd really like to talk to me about my trip. And so I went literally straight to the synagogue. He interviewed me. And then I went home and had a nap, and it was on the 5 o'clock ABC News. Yeah, it was on the ABC News. What was funny is that Jen and I went out for a walk, and we were walking our dog by the synagogue, and lo and behold, the same reporter is there, and he's doing a live shot, right, to introduce the piece. And so I pulled it up on my phone on YouTube TV, and I was able to watch TV. Anyways, it was a real moment. So I want to do, I talked for a while, although I really, really welcome your questions. And so feel free to interrupt me if you want to hear more than that. I literally don't know where to begin. There's so much that I would like to share. And I did my best this morning during a couple of other Zoom meetings that I had to be part of. I was multitasking and tried to put together some notes. So I'll do my best. The first thing that I want to do is just take a moment of silence to remember and to think about many people. So today is day 42. Day 42 since October 7th, 42 days. I would like to invite us to think about the hostages, either 239 and possibly 240 because one may have been born in captivity. But we also know back down to 239 that one was found dead yesterday. To think about all those who were murdered and injured on October 7th, all those who are recovering, all of Israel's soldiers who are at this moment in harm's way. And I want to remind us all of the importance of continuing to let our hearts expand and to think about the millions of Palestinians, of innocent Palestinians whose lives have been uprooted and who are suffering or in harm's way. I think needlessly, unfortunately, but we think about all of them for a moment. Thank you. So my mom, who is on the Zoom, I'll begin with her. She, at some point, I can't remember when exactly, I told her or she heard from somebody that I was going to Israel. She left me a voicemail. It was very, very hectic in the days leading up to my trip. So I got on the plane, I connected through Boston, and I called her from the airport, said hi. And I'm in my notes, what I wrote down is that I heard the worry in her voice. And so the most important question one could ask is, why would I worry my mother? Why do this trip? As it came together, it was called a rabbinic solidarity mission. But one of the things that I have come to really understand that was explained to me by the guide on our trip is that it wasn't really a solidarity mission, it was a Shiva visit. So I want to just start by reading from Maimonides, chapter 14, his laws of mourning. Thank you. Thanks, that's great. His laws of mourning, he says, mitzvah taseh shel divreihem levaker. It is a positive commandment from rabbinic law to visit the sick, comfort the mourners, escort the dead, dower the bride, accompany the departing guests, and involve oneself in all burial needs, to carry the dead, to walk before the dead, to eulogize, to dig and bury, likewise to bring cheer to the bride and the groom and assist them in whatever they need. And these are the acts of kindness, gemilut chasadim, that one does with one's body. And there is no quantified limit. In other words, you're never done doing acts, all of the things that were described there, doing acts of gemilut chasadim. Even though all these are of rabbinic origin, they are implied by the biblical verse, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. Whatever you would want others to do for you, you should do for your sibling, for your brother or sister in Torah and mitzvot. So that's why I got on a plane. To try to fulfill the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And as I did, one of the things that became very clear to me is that for the past 6 weeks, all of Israel has been engaged in all of these things, in visiting the sick, in comforting so many mourners, in escorting the dead. In dowering the bride, there have been weddings and beautiful proposals that have taken place in the middle of the war. In having guests over to your home, involving oneself in all of the burial needs, and assisting people with whatever they need. I told you our guide was named Ron. He lives in Ashkelon. He moved to Ashkelon from Tel Aviv because you can't buy a closet in Tel Aviv for less than $1 million. It's very, very expensive housing. So he moved to Ashkelon, which is much more affordable. It's very affordable right now. And he said to us, he gave me this idea of that when we lose family members, we just want someone to hug us. And it was very humbling and an honor to be able to just hug a lot of people. I'll share a story with you from Ron. You know, I think we know the details. If you don't, the massacre, he was woken up at 6:28 on Shabbat morning, on Simchat Torah morning. Simchat Torah in Israel is celebrated the same day as Shmini Atzeret, so it was on Shabbat, whereas for us, it was Saturday night, Sunday. There was a massive, massive rocket attack. People in Ashkelon are unfortunately very used to rockets. They have been under sporadic rocket fire. Let us not forget that this rocket fire was not new. They've been under sporadic rocket fire really for the past 15 years, or really since Israel left Gaza. There was a short period during which the Palestinian Authority had control over Gaza. They were overthrown by Hamas. Hamas has been the sole governing authority, if that's what you want to call it, there. And since then, Israel left everything. They actually left them greenhouses, left them a nice infrastructure, and they have taken hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid and invested it in a system of tunnels that is believed to be somewhere around 300 kilometers long, 180 miles worth of tunnels, not just concrete, but air conditioning, water, electricity. All of that could have been used for the building of hospitals and bomb shelters. There was a huge rocket attack, and Rowan lives on the 6th floor of his apartment, and the Ma'amad, the safe room, is not in his. I think only 40 or 50% of apartments in Israel actually have a Ma'amad, which is a steel reinforced concrete room, a safe room in the apartment itself. So he ran down 6 floors of stairs. By 8 a.m., there were already reports of terrorists who were driving through the cities of the South in Toyotas. One of the white Toyotas was found yesterday by the Israeli army in the parking lot of the Shifa hospital. They know that that was one of the Toyotas that was used. It was found with weapons, parked in the parking lot of the Shifa hospital. I'll come back to that. And as a reminder, the Israeli government, the army, fell down. Essentially, there were no army presence until the late afternoon or evening time. There were terrorists roaming through these cities, and there was an ongoing massacre. Rowan described it. He said this was actually nothing compared to the Yom Kippur War. In the Yom Kippur War, it was a surprise attack. Israel was overrun at the Golan Heights, but you did not actually have civilians who were killed in that part of the Yom Kippur War. It was soldiers who were murdered. This was primarily focused on civilians. And so the one observation that I have that I wrote down, I just wanted to share with you, is that there's a lot of thinking about how do we understand what happened. There are comparisons to the Holocaust, there are comparisons to 9/11. I do want to just sort of say that to remind us that comparisons are never equal. It's okay to use them, and there's even a value of viewing what happens to us through the lens of history. That's called memory, not history, and that's a good thing in the Jewish tradition. And yet, we should also acknowledge each thing for its uniqueness. But I do want to just address the 9/11 comparison. People have said, there were 1,400 people murdered. That is the equivalent of, 40,000 Americans in one day. There were only just a little under 3,000 Americans who were murdered. And whatever, those are comparisons you can make. But what I came to really understand was different about October 7th is the intimacy of what took place. When we think about 9/11, there were 4 planes. One was crashed in Pennsylvania, 2 into the 2 towers, and 1 into the Pentagon. And there were almost 3,000 people who died. They died, obviously, a horrific death, and there was, none of this is an Impression Olympics, suffering Olympics, but it was one moment. It was a massive explosion and fire, and it was done by 15 Al-Qaeda terrorists. This was not that. This was 3,000 Hamas fighters coming into people's homes, into their living rooms, and it was individually committing 1,400 acts of brutal rape, of individual cruel killing, murder, beheading, torture, the burning of people alive. And 240 people taken away, each by an individual person, right? Or 1 or 2, sometimes a family at a time, and dragging them, kicking and screaming into hell. And And I say that there's a tremendous intimacy of what happened. And so the trauma that Israel is experienced and is recovering from is unique, as every suffering is unique, and it is not it is not a contest. But I want to just, I think one thing which I want to say is, please do not play the numbers game. Okay? It's much more complicated than that. And to say, well, 10,000 versus 1,400, right? Which, and we can talk all about that number, 10,000 or whatever it is, but and every one of those deaths is horrible and awful. And we can't lose the ability to make distinctions. Distinctions are what separate us from the ability to reason, is what separates us, according to some of the rabbis, from animals. It is literally what makes us human. And so I want to just remind us to hold on to that ability to make distinctions. I wrote a couple of emails, one from the airport in Boston and one from my Aunt Debbie's the morning before this trip with other rabbis got started, and I sent those to the congregation. If you didn't get one, there are a whole bunch of Bethel people here who did, and they can share those emails with you. And I'm going to skip over most of that part of my trip, and begin really on Monday morning. The group of us gathered at the airport, and immediately we got into the bus, we got going, and the bus broke down. And so our first meeting was in Tel Aviv. And so the tour company that we worked with, and by the way, I forgot to mention, there were, as you'll hear, if you're interested on Sunday, we have a very, very busy day on Sunday. I will be speaking in church on Sunday morning at the Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church from 10 to 11. At 11:15 to about 1 o'clock or 1:15, I think, is a congregational lunch with Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church in Bethel. For those of you who don't know, we were roommates for a year. Basically, while Bethel was under construction, we had our services at Trinity Avenue. They are dear friends of ours. And then I think it's scheduled for 1:30 at the JCC. I am going to be speaking alongside with Rabbi Matt Soffer and Sophia Abram and Ari Medoff. I feel like I forgot there's a fourth. What? And Dan Schnitzer, Bethel's president. And they will be speaking about a trip that they made. It was a shorter trip, they landed Sunday night and left Tuesday night. It was just Monday and Tuesday on the ground. They focused specifically on this community's relationship with Nir Oz, which is one of the kibbutzim. They traveled down to Eilat and met with, which is where most of the residents from that kibbutz are basically sheltering, and they are for. It looks like it's going to be at least a year before any of those communities can make their way home. And I want to just give over some numbers. There are, we estimate, 250,000 Israelis who have been displaced, both from the communities of the south and also from an ongoing missile barrage and threats from the north, from Hezbollah. And I want to get back to the stories, but I will just say to you that I do not believe that this is going to end without there being a confrontation with Hezbollah, because here is how to think about this. It is, I'll read you all the way from the bottom. Daniel Gordis wrote on his blog as follows. He said, let's see if I can find it. Don't lose it. Hold on, it's somewhere else. No, I'm going to lose it. But basically, what he said is, look, um, the state of Israel could lose territory without one enemy soldier, one enemy boot on its, on its territory, if those communities become unlivable. And so the litmus test for what to do now is, would you take your families and go live at the border with Gaza or at the northern border? And if you wouldn't, then Israel has no choice as a sovereign state but to make sure that those families can. So the bus broke down. And so they called some taxis, they minivans, and they put us into these minivans, and we drove. We got driving, and we got to talking with our driver. Our driver's name was Yedidia, and Yedidia told us that he was in Gaza the day before. So we're getting a ride from him in the cab on Monday morning. On Sunday, he was in Gaza. Two of his friends were killed in a booby trap. He said that the Israeli Air Force and the drones and everything tried to basically protect the soldiers from things that they can't see overhead, but one got missed, and two of his friends died, and that he was going back tomorrow. And I said, "What are you doing here?" I don't want you to spend your precious time. He said, "No, it's okay. A friend of mine called me, and he said he really needed someone to run. He runs this business, and he needed a driver for an hour." I was like, "Oh my God!" The last thing I wanted to do in going to Israel is be a burden on anybody. We were like trying not to be a burden, and here we're getting a ride from this soldier on the day off. I told him, how grateful. I told him who we are. He was incredibly moved by our trip, and I gave him what I did bring with me is that I had the kids in the congregation in the Beit in our Talmud Torah make cards, and I gave him a card, and he said he was going to take it and show it to his fellow soldiers. He really appreciated it. And I have this. I have a nice picture of Yedidia. But that should give you a sense of the intimacy of this war. So another thing which I'll say is that in the United States, when soldiers go off to war, they go off somewhere. They get in a plane, they get on a ship, they fly away, they sail away, they're gone. They experience war, they have that stuff, and then they come back. In Israel, the front is an hour and a half drive at the most. Most you can get to the northern border of Israel or to Gaza in most a 2-hour drive from virtually everywhere in Israel. And so later in the trip, on the last end of the trip, we visited. Those of you who saw the TV thing saw that I had a helmet and a vest. We went to the Gaza border, and we visited a military base. And one of the things that struck me at the military base is that at this military base at the Gaza border, there's a parking lot. And soldiers drove to the base. Right? They're not getting on buses, they're not getting on aircraft carriers to fly away somewhere. They're in their houses in Tel Aviv or wherever they are. And okay, I gotta go to the war now. And they get in their car and they drive for an hour and a half, and they're to the military base. We visited a number of organizations. We visited an organization. I have my swag. So I have all these different organizations have bracelets. So this one is from Brothers for Life, Achim L'Chaim, which is a beautiful name, sort of brothers who are this. And by the way, they're looking at a name change because there are also female soldiers who they are helping. So brothers and sisters or siblings or whatever it'll be. But meaning forever, right? For life. And also that organization focuses specifically on trying to help people either recover from or even prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. In their care, before the war, there were 517 excuse me, they had about 13 or 1400 injured soldiers, and getting people to participate is a whole thing. But they had about 13 or 1400 soldiers in their network on October 6th, of soldiers who they were actively helping through treatment programs. There are other projects where they meet with American soldiers and they have a sort of a facility there where they have a pool and where they do hydrotherapy, but they also can just relax and be with each other, whatever. So they had 13 to 1400 people in their care. Since October 7th, there are 517 newly injured soldiers. And one aspect to keep in mind of this is that every military person who I've met says that the type of combat that Israel is engaged in at the moment is the worst type of combat possible, urban warfare. Urban warfare with booby traps and with tunnels and embedded, deeply embedded in civilians, and purposely embedded within civilians. We'll talk more about that. We then went to Tel Aviv and visited an extraordinary place, which is, it's basically the headquarters that has been set up. And I think that this was done with the help. There's been a huge transition. So if you remember, 2 months ago, I was probably talking with you about Israel and the judicial reforms. You remember all that? By the way, a little thing, Yossi Klein Halevi said he started his session with us. We had a session with him on the following morning. He said, I am more optimistic now about the state of Israel than I was 2 months ago. He said, because 2 months, because the transition and the extraordinary unity that people have, and unity, not just hanging flags, there are a lot of flags, but there were flags in the judicial protest, but in a way that we cannot even begin to fathom, people taking care of each other. And when I say taking care of each other, I mean literally opening up their homes. I mean giving each other material support in 1,000 different ways. So Israel has set up, and the judicial protest movement shifted basically from doing that to basically doing a lot of the work. The government has utterly failed. This government has utterly failed. There were problems with the government before, to say the least, but this has been an utter failure of the government. There was a poll that came out, I think, this morning that Gantz and the coalition they would lose in a landslide, like 72 seats or something like that. I think the current coalition and Bibi would get I think Bibi would get 19 votes or something like that. It's a huge look at the poll. And the judicial reform movement is basically doing governmental functions, both with relief work, but they also help to set up this center for the hostages. And so we had a meeting with diplomats, and not people in Israel's diplomatic corps, but former diplomats, Israel's former ambassadors to Norway, Switzerland, 15 other former, they are retired, they're on pension, and they came back and they said, look, if this is being done, we're happy to hand it back over to you, but it's not, and we know how to do this. So we're going to step up and do this. And they've started working diplomatic channels. Right? All of this, again, spontaneous volunteer. There's a department for finances because you need to have the finances to do all of this work. They got obviously donated a big office space in downtown Tel Aviv, technical things from the setting up of internet and phones and all that stuff. They have departments for domestic media, for foreign media, for social media. There's a huge social media effort so that these hostages are not forgotten. There's a whole department of psychologists who are working to try to support these families. And I met some of these families. And I looked across and saw the faces of people whose loved ones are in Gaza. and they need support, and they need support, psychological support. There's a whole department set up, to pushing and monitoring the negotiations, and also thinking about medical needs, right? There are, okay, so for this group, I'm just going to say, right, could you go without your medicines and everything for 6 weeks? Right? There are 75 and 85-year-old hostages. There was a 9-month-old baby who was taken, right? There are tremendous medical needs. And so they have a whole setup, right, trying to think about that and relay that information. All that information, basically 240 medical records, they're trying to get at least to the International Red Cross. By the way, every one of you should go home and write an angry email to the International Red Cross, which of course, right, it's an abomination, right? Under every rule of war and in every other case that exists, the International Red Cross is given the ability to visit hostages. Not one visit, nothing, no information. Judy asked, is it because of the refusal of Hamas and the unwillingness of the Red Cross? And it's both. And it's both. It's both. Hamas, refuses, and the Red Cross doesn't push. They don't insist. By the way, and they're, make no bones about it, they're doing plenty of relief work in South Gaza, right? They're banging on the table saying Israel is immoral, Israel is terrible, you should let in more aid. By now there have been hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of things that have been let in, whatever. But the Israeli hostages, nothing. We also, at this center, got the opportunity to meet with, to begin hearing from families of the hostages. We met a woman named Merav. If I had the ability to share my screen, I would show you, right, it's not on up there. Those of you who are on Zoom, I'll just share my screen for a second, and you can take a look. And if you're on your phones, you may be able to look up Merav. Hold on for 1 second. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here she is. Okay. For those of you on Zoom, excuse me, Merav is her mom. Her name is Romi Gonen. You can look up her picture. She was last heard from at 10:58 on Saturday morning. We met her mom, Merav. Hold on, I just have to go back to my notes now. She has five kids. She lives in the Western Galilee. And the Western Galilee is among Arab Israelis. By the way, you know who's not protesting against Israel and its war? Israeli Arabs. Okay. Anyways, you can just put a pin in that. Okay. But Romi moved to Tel Aviv. She was at the festival. She called her mom crying hysterically at 6:33. We also met somebody named Devere, and I'm going to tell you more about Devere and his story. But in our group, we visited Kfar Aza, which was another one of the kibbutzim. And there's a story, I posted a little bit about this on Facebook, and there's a story that you can see, you can find. It's about twins. So there was a mother and a father. The mother, they were in the safe room. The mother went out to get a bottle for the twin. She was murdered. They came into the safe room. They murdered the father. The twins were left crying on the bed for 14 hours. Many other babies were killed. They were left crying on the bed as bait. People around the kibbutz heard the twins crying. They came to try to rescue them. And Hamas parked itself on the roof and shot people to use them as bait. Miraculously, the twins ultimately were rescued. We met later, another one of the organizations we visited was from Hatzalah. Hatzalah is this very remarkable Israeli organization. It's the orange bracelet. You call 1221, and they have trained basically not paramedics but emergency responders, and it's entirely volunteer, and it's this network, and it's entirely free, by the way, where an ambulance or a first responder will come. They have a whole system, incredible system set up where it will find the person who's on duty, who's the closest. They answer the phone within 5 to 7 seconds, and they have the fastest response rate of any first responders in the world anywhere. They also give people these mopeds, right, to drive that have emergency stuff in the back. So by the way, as the next fundraiser, we may, since we did an ambulance, it's a little less expensive, but we may do a moped. We met the guy who got the twins, and he didn't know what to do with them. And he got the call. They didn't know what the soldiers didn't know what to do, and he said, we're giving them water. He said, give them water, don't give them anything else, because we don't know what they're allergic to, right? And they got them to the hospital, and they're fine. We met Devere. Devere is their uncle. Right? We heard Devere's story, heard that story, and you can find it now on CBS News also. So you can go and hear some of that story. But later in the trip, the next day, we went to Shfaim. Shfaim is a kibbutz just a little bit north of Tel Aviv, Herzliya. It's I've been there actually many times because it's where Ramah used to do its training for Israeli shlichim. Whatever, it's a kibbutz there. It's where 50% of the kibbutz of Kfar Aza is now living. We walk into the room where because there's sort of an activity room, and on the ground we see a woman, and she's playing with babies, and it's the twins. And we said, you're Devere's sister, right? So we heard Devere's story. We then went to Tel Aviv. In the center of Tel Aviv, some of you may have seen this on Facebook. There are all of these incredible art installations. It's where the original Shabbat table, right, was set up. So we saw the Shabbat table. We saw an installation of 240 beds, except they're not all beds because of a bunch of them are cribs. There's an installation outside of Israel's Opera Museum with 240 mannequins, and many other art installations. At 5 p.m., the Masorti movement, Israel's sister conservative movement, has set up a daily tefillah, a daily prayer service, not sort of mincha, not in the statutory sense, but and one of the rabbis in our community was asked to recite the prayer for the hostages. We took part in that prayer service, and then I did have the wonderful experience as I was sitting there at the prayer service. I felt a touch on my shoulder. I turned around. It was one of my former campers from Camperline, California. Israel is a small place, and he lives in Jerusalem. But he said, I just came down to Tel Aviv. I felt a need to be here. And then he saw me, and I gave him a warm hug. We finished the first day. We went back towards Jerusalem. We met Alon Tal, formerly known as Albert Rosenthal. Is that right? Albert Rosenthal grew up at Bethel and Beth Meyer, moved to Israel. He became basically a congressperson, a member of Knesset in not this government, but the last one. And he came and met us for dinner and talked to us. He actually spent a number of days, either because the current Knesset members are persona non grata. People don't want them there. Not that they've been going, but they don't want them at funerals. People are absolutely furious with the government. And they didn't have enough people to go to funerals. So Alon basically went to funerals and shivas for days and days and days on end. But it was good to connect with him. By the way, he was at Rosh Hashanah services at Bethel, right, this a few months ago. The following morning, we met with Yossi Klein Halevi. If you don't follow Yossi Klein Halevi, please follow him. His writings, and he has a podcast with the Hartman Institute. I could spend really the rest of this time going through Yossi's presentation to us. I'll never get to anything else, and so I'm gonna give you a few highlights. I have to choose them right now because I didn't have a chance to really think about this more. So one of the things that he pointed out, the Tikkun Olam, in modern parlance, it means repairing the world, and it has a very universalistic idea behind it, right? That Jews are Jews because we participate in the process of repairing the larger world. I don't want to minimize that at all, but there is a particularly American Jewish way of sort of valuing that and latching onto that. But the original meaning of Tikkun Olam, right, comes from a passage in the Mishnah where the rabbis are debating the question of redeeming hostages. And they say, you can't pay too high a price for redeeming hostages because of Tikkun Olam. And what do they mean by that? Did you hear what I said? You're not allowed to pay too high a price. In other words, don't pay $1 million to redeem one hostage. And Yossi Klein Halevi said, I look back at the Gilad Shalit deal, and he said it was a mistake. Israel returned 1,000 hostages, one of whom is responsible for the planning of October 7th for Gilad Shalit. And there's a piece of that moment was celebrated in Israel, and it was the embodiment of something really, really beautiful, which is that we get our kids home. And the rabbis were not heartless, but they said, when you live in a world like that, then you are raising the price for hostages for everybody else, and you're making hostages valuable and worthwhile, and you're inviting more hostage taking. And Tikkun Olam says, don't do that because you're ruining the world for everybody else. And that's a very different understanding of Tikkun Olam than the one that we have. And in some ways, if you want to understand the tension that will emerge between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community, it is between those definitions of Tikkun Olam. And that if Israel pays too high a price to redeem these 240 captives, then they will lose their credibility in the Middle East more than it's already been lost, and it's been lost a lot. And that might make everybody feel better, but it will have long-term consequences that are enormous. Yossi said, he said, quote, I will go to jail as part of the demonstrations to bring down this government the day after the war is over. Okay? And he said he believes that those demonstrations are going to be led by the families of the hostages and the families of the people murdered. When this is over, we can expect two things. One of them is a strengthening of the far right, because there is, because of hatred of Palestinians. I wish it wasn't all Palestinians. We have every right in the world to hate Hamas, and I don't want to hate all Palestinians, but a lot of Israel feels that way, and in some ways it's going to strengthen the far right. And he said he really believes that that Israel desires healing, and he really does believe that there'll be a move to the center, away from the extremism of the right. And I will just address one small thing. I addressed this in an editorial that I wrote along with 32 other rabbis in terms of the ceasefire. There's no there is I don't want to say no, but there is virtually no ceasefire movement in Israel. The people to the farthest left of the farthest left in Israel, and they were many of the people murdered. And just recently there was another tremendous peace activist whose body was found, and they thought she was a hostage, and they figured it out. Her body was found. And by the way, when I say body was found, I left early. My colleagues stayed and were on Thursday, and the place that they went on Thursday was an army base called Shura, which is where they are doing the work of identifying bodies. Okay, it's 6 weeks later when you are hearing about this person has died. It's not that Eric Myers can tell you they have been employing biblical archaeologists to sort through and to try to find the remains. Okay, but so one of the things that is very deeply painful to me, and I have publicly made known my stance about of why I don't think a ceasefire is wise. There are a lot of reasons that I don't think that that's the case, but one of them is that I really view it as I think it is heard as an act of betrayal by most Israelis in a time when solidarity is called for. And I think that one of the ways that you can ask yourself sort of my opinions about this is, are there people in Israel who are partners, right? In other words, am I supporting somebody in Israel? And I'll say it even more deeply, which is, guys, we are not going to bear the consequences. I think that we should weigh in on Jewish pluralism in Israel. I think we should weigh in on the Kotel. Okay? Diaspora Jews have not only the right, but the responsibility to participate in the conversation about what happens in Israel on certain topics. But I don't have the right to weigh in on taxes because it's not my money. Hey, if you want to say, well, okay, but American dollars are going to support, right? Second, third. But the choices about who will live or die, about whose children are going to go off to fight or not fight, about the consequences of this war are not ours. And so I always try to measure things of who in Israel am I supporting right now, right? Let me move off of that because I know it's complicated, and I know I don't want it to be a divisive thing in our community. And I'm not speaking about this from the Bima, okay? I wrote about this in an op-ed because I thought it was important that the community have what I understand to be sort of the majority voice represented, because it's something that I believe in, but I also am trying to hold our community together. In terms of Yossi Klein Halevi, the solution to Gaza is going to require a regional solution, and the Saudis have to be brought back in. The Palestinian Authority, it's not clear. They are not strong enough right now. It's not clear that they actually are committed to not teaching their children to hate Jews and to hate Israel. I hate Bibi, and blind squirrel catches a few, or whatever it is, and it gets a few nuts every once in a while. When he says that whatever continues in Gaza cannot raise another generation of, he's right. Okay, we can't have somebody else go in there. The Saudis are making moves in that direction. They are moving away from this education towards hate and they can play a very, very important role. By the way, if there was a summit over the weekend, last Shabbos, the Arab, wherever it was, and the Iranian group put together this, bunch of things. It was vetoed by all of the Sunni Muslim powers, and the Crown Prince has demanded two things publicly. One of them was a ceasefire because that's what they have to do, but the other one was the immediate return of the hostages, which was a signal to Israel that we're in the game. Okay, but whatever happens in Gaza afterward is going to require regional, and that Yossi also emphasized. Please understand that this is not a conflict between Israel and Hamas. Okay, all of this is a conflict with Iran. Okay, Hezbollah and Hamas are proxies of the Iranian government. It's a very good strategy. Iran doesn't pay a price on its own territory. Okay. And part of the reason that Biden brought 2 aircraft carriers there and their groups is to say that if you get into it with Hezbollah, then you're going to potentially can start paying a price for this in your own territories. And that probably would begin with the striking of both the nuclear program, because that's been on the agenda for a while, and also the oil, right? Basically destroying their oil, which would set their economy back for 30 years. Right? I'm sorry to. The other thing which Yossi talked about was the importance of sort of using this as a reset for the diaspora Israel model. There's been a model of, the job of American Jews is to give support and send money. And Israel, and he says, no, right? Actually, this is an important moment for a reset, that Israel doesn't have democracy in its kishkas. Okay, I love Herzog. It was very nice, but it wasn't true, right? When he said in front of the Congress that democracy is our kitchens, it's not. It's in process. But remember, I had a Shabbos dinner with Russian Jews, not a Shabbos dinner, but a Saturday, a Havdalah dinner with Russian Jews. Okay, they're friends of my aunts. They're not democracy lovers. Okay, they present in modern fonts as white. Okay, because they have white skin. They're not Western European. Okay, they don't value liberal values. Okay, none of the Jews who are the majority in Israel, who are not white in skin color, in it and any other way, North Africans, Jews from Arab countries, they don't have a history of democracy. Okay, American Jews have a history of democracy. We can give that to Israelis. We have an important role to play in that. In that part of the relationship, and as he said, it needs to be a relationship of grown-ups. Okay, American Judaism, the pluralism, the creativity of American Judaism, and our commitment to democratic values, etc., have something to give to Israelis, and Israel, of course, has something to give to us. Yossi's big thing is music. He loves, if you want to, Rabbi Sager, Alav Shalom, right? It was Israeli poetry, and there's a whole insight into Judaism that is played out in Israeli music. The last thing that Yossi said not the last thing, but he also said that he believes there is an idea that Israel is just creating more terrorists by doing this. He said, no, not necessarily, and that's a talking point. But the Saudis and the Sunni Muslim countries did the Abraham Accords for one reason, because Israel was strong. Okay? And they saw them as a potential ally in this larger struggle between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, and that in many ways, I'll say a couple of other things. We don't really know what even Palestinians in Gaza think. Okay? When you see them interviewed, if somebody has a gun, right, or is going to threaten to murder your entire family, and then you go on a TV show, are you going to say something? The woman, you remember when there was two women, there was an older woman who was released as a hostage, and she got back and she said, actually, they treated me very nicely. You think they treated her nicely? Can you depend upon that? Of course not. Why? Her husband is a hostage. When people are threatened, you cannot trust the veracity of what they are telling you. So you may see dozens and dozens of, by the way, it's also starting to come out now that many Gazans are furious with Hamas and they want to be freed of Hamas. And so there's, and let me also say, I also want to say, and Israel is being forced to do terrible things. We're wrong. Okay, I just want to throw that out there. I don't believe that we are, and I don't know. But I also just want to cultivate within all of us the humility to say that, number one, we're not paying the price for this, and number two, we don't know. We don't know what the right thing is to do. It could be that I don't, and there are lots of reasons why I can tell you this. I do not believe that Israel is committing war crimes. I have a whole other thing on my, and maybe I'll come back. Maybe this is what I'll do in December. There's a wonderful and important article by Moshe Halbertal, who's one of the world's leading ethicists on international law. And he has a whole article on asymmetrical warfare. And I prepared a whole sheet, and maybe in December, this is what I will do, is we'll focus our study on the questions of asymmetrical warfare, which is what Israel is involved in, which is versus symmetrical warfare, and questions of just law theory. There's a whole science to this. Israel trains, as I wrote in the op-ed, it trains people. It has the most sophisticated, like America, lawyers who are reviewing every strike and trying to assess it for whether it's a just strike. So, the United Nations, somebody sent me something. The United Nations put something on their website. It said there is clear evidence that Israel may be committing war crimes. And somebody sent this to me. And said, it's clear that there's war crimes. And I said, no, look at what it says. It says there's clear evidence that there may be war crimes, right? Which is to say, we have clear evidence that there are a lot of people being killed by bombs. But no, we don't know. Nobody can say to you, yes, these are war crimes, because war crimes actually, again, go back to that, make distinctions. War crimes are not just lots of people dying. War is awful. War itself is a crime. Okay, I get that. And as I wrote, and as my teacher said, Yehuda Kurtzer, that pacifism in the face of utter evil is morally untenable. So you have to wage war. And we don't evaluate whether or not something is a war crime based upon how many victims there are. There were more victims there were more civilians killed in Nazi Germany. Does that mean that the Nazis and the Germany were the righteous ones? Of course not. Yisrael Hayom, Bibi's newspaper, most conservative, it was funded by Sheldon Adelson, said in its lead editorial last week that Mansour Abbas, who Bibi trotted out time and again as a racist, he was the Islamist who was included in the last government of Israel. Israel Hayom said that Mansour Abbas has to be part of the next government. Mansour Abbas did what Bibi hasn't. Okay, there was somebody in Bibi's government who said, let's nuke Iran, and Bibi let's nuke Gaza, and Bibi suspended him. Didn't kick him out of the government because he knows he could lose his coalition, so he suspended him. Mansour Abbas had somebody in his government who was doubting the veracity that there were rapes that took place on October 7th. Mansour Abbas said, you're out of here. This has no place with us. Okay? I'm going to say some other things here, mindful. So We are so, so blessed to have friend in Imam Abdullah Anteli. He is virtually alone. I'm not even going to talk about worldwide Muslim leadership. The American Muslim leadership has been an utter failure. I wish I could tell you otherwise. I have had, and I will continue to keep my heart open. Many of you know Maulid Ali. He was an imam who came to Bethel. He spoke, he moved to Minneapolis. He is, and I have not followed every social media post, but I have yet to see a condemnation of the massacre on October 7th. And media posts accuse Israel of genocide, and they are a cesspool of anti-Semitic. And what Yossi said is that the program that he started with the Imam Abdullah Anteli it's been a failure. They invested 10 years in trying to create, and that the people who have come on the program, it's been a failure. And the only moral voices, and when I say moral voices, I'll give you another one. Okay. William Barber, the Bishop William Barber, he's been the head of the Moral Mondays movement. He's been very critical of Israel's occupation. Nobody can accuse him of being soft in it. He wrote a very impressive piece a few days, 3 or 4 days after October 7th, and he said, "We in the Black community know something about resistance. Raping people, beheading people, mercilessly murdering innocents is not resistance." He had the moral courage to come and say, and he said, "I'm going to continue to call out Israel on its moral failings, on the occupation, on all of these things." And when Students for Justice in Palestine tells you that October 7th was justified because it's resistance to white colonialism, it's a moral failing. And by the way, many of the university presidents in the United States have also had moral failings, okay? And their job, I don't expect it of CEOs, although the NFL and Major League Baseball have actually been pretty good, okay? But their job is education. They're in the education business. They can't figure out how to say it. And if they did, it took them a while, okay? And unfortunately, the American Muslim community has failed. The last thing which Yossi talked about, and then I want to get on to more stories, is that one of the deep challenges of this sort of anti-Zionism for Americans is that the campus, really the American college campus, is our home. It was the gateway for Jews to achieve success and belonging in the United States. And our kids, and when I say our kids, what I mean by this, I know that not all of our kids, are even pro-Israel or whatever. But even if you are anti-Israel, even if you are a Jewish anti-Zionist, right? Even if you are anti-Israel, just as an act of solidarity with your fellow Jews, you should care that people at Cooper Union had to barricade, that Jewish students at Cornell got death threats. Our fundamentally, and it's not every one of them. Thank God Benjamin's at UNC Greensboro. They're doing fine. UNC Greensboro, thank God. Right? It's I did a college tour with Ranon at Virginia Tech. There was a Palestinian demonstration. It was small. It was fine. Right? I didn't love some of the language. Okay, but there are large segments of the American Jewish college students who feel physically unsafe on college campuses. I'm not talking about teacups, like they can't hear things that they disagree with. I'm talking about they feel physically unsafe on college campuses. Why is that okay? But we need to understand, he said that part of the reason that it is so painful is that again, that's it's a place that actually was a gateway for American Jews. So here's the Daniel Hortis thing. I'll just read this to you. Here's the question you have to ask, and then I'm going to get back to stories. I have 20 more minutes of stories. The question you have to ask in terms of, ceasefire or not ceasefire, the end of the war, is, he puts it this way: what sort of parents would take their kids back to their homes near Gaza if Hamas is not completely wiped out? What parents would subject these kids to rocket fire? Rocket fire, by the way, at best. Okay, you're talking about the threat of invasion. They won't. If Israel does not completely destroy Hamas, the area around Gaza will be uninhabitable. By the way, 1948, Green Line, no occupation. If what you mean by Palestine will be free is the Gaza and the West Bank. If what you mean is then pre-47, then which is where all of this happened, right? Inside the Greek, then that's different, okay? Then we're talking about this is an existential war, which seems like what it is. He says if the same with the North, which is now emptied of civilians. Israel could lose territory without a single enemy boot on our territory. Israel could mostly destroy Hamas and still lose the war. Okay. By the way, it's very likely you had everybody go to the north. From what I understand, many of the experts believe that the hostages are in the south. And it's not like Hamas didn't exist in the south of Gaza. And so Israel is going to have to do operations in the south of Gaza. And there's going to be screaming and yelling, oh, you made everybody go there. That was the humanitarian safe place. Yes, and we're going to try and keep everybody in these safe zones, but that doesn't mean that Israel cannot do operations in Gaza because there's a whole network of tunnel in the south of Gaza. It's hard to imagine Israelis accepting that, and it's hard to imagine any government of Israel. I hate this government, and it was and continues to be democratically elected. And there is, the current government, which is a war government, has that broad support, even though a lot of people, they're just waiting to get Bibi out. But it's still a democratically, they're not doing things here. This war is not Vietnam. It's not something where Israelis are saying, stop the war. Quite the opposite. There's virtually nobody in Israel who is against what this government is doing. And so the government that doesn't win the war completely is not going to survive that. And he said it's also not so hard to imagine the world trying not to make that happen. And so Israel and Jews are going to be alone. That's what's coming. We went to Ashkelon. Some of you saw on social media, we drove to Ashkelon. Ashkelon is about, 7, maybe 10 miles from the Gaza border. It's been the city that's been very, very heavily shelled with rockets over the last 15 years. It is actually, it's far enough away and a big enough city. It's not actually completely evacuated. It's a pretty big city. And so we drove there. We went to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, there was a red alert. We scurried off and got next to a wall, and I saw, the Iron Dome in action. I did not mean for this to be some sort of G.I. Joe trip, right? But by the way, the other thing is I wrote about this in my email that it turns out on my way, my aunt picked me up at the airport, and then while I was at the airport, there was a red alert in Herzliya. So she missed the red alert because of me. Anyways, we visited injured soldiers, and we met with soldiers whose sole job is essentially helping injured soldiers. liaising with their families. It's this whole part of the Israeli army. We met with an organization called Natal. Natal is a great organization. It's the green one. They work with not soldiers specifically suffering from PTSD, but from everybody else. Right? They basically do mental health services in Israel. There are thousands of people who are struggling with PTSD, either because they've grown up under missile fire or because they survived. Think about all of the survivors of October 7th. In the things we heard from the head of the organization on October 7th, the 6:30 in the morning, they heard about the rockets. They switched from their routine, which is they usually have 3 people on call overnight, getting phone calls to this 1-800 number. They switched to their emergency mode. Their Natal's 1-800 number was on all 3 of the Israeli TV channels being broadcast that morning, and they usually get 50 to 100 calls per day. And on October 7th, they had 2,000 phone calls to their hotline by 8:30 in the morning. Okay. And many of those calls were from people who were in Otef Aza, who were in that area, calling from their safe rooms because the ambulances weren't coming and the army wasn't coming, and they felt helpless, and so they called Natal. And so you had a whole bunch of people on the phone trying to reassure people in their safe rooms. And as I said, the government has really fallen down, and so these people went to the hotels in the Dead Sea, and they've gone to Eilat, and they've gone to Shfaim, and they've gone to all of these places that are the absorption centers for the people who survived the massacre, and they've been providing continuous trauma therapy and support and everything for people who survived what happened, and they're advising the government. There are stupid things, where I wrote this down that the kibbutz, right? So the kibbutz is sort of it's its own organization, and so at the hotel they set up. We're just paying for lunches, and so the kibbutz members would walk in, but the residents of Sderot, right? They're not a kibbutz, and so they had to pay for their lunches, right? And you're going, what in the world? And so they had to tell the government, and the government was like, oh yeah, I guess we should put aside some money to pay for the lunches for people. We met with Natal. We went to Shfaim, as I mentioned, and we met with and heard more stories from people who are from Kfar Aza. I told you that we saw the twins. A good friend of mine, his name is Alon Fuderman. He's the son of Matthew Fuderman, who's a conservative and Masorti rabbi. Alon is amazing, Israeli American, and very, very talented. He's now the director of the Kfar Aza Foundation. He's sort of in charge of trying to rebuild everything that's happening there. And then, as I said, we went to Kfar Aza. We toured the place where the massacre happened. When you go, that was where we had the helmets and the jackets. There are drones. You can hear a buzz of drones all the time. There's constant drone monitoring. It's this. You've heard a drone before, I know. There was regular artillery. There's something in military things called suppression fire, where every few minutes, I don't know exactly how it works, but there's a lot of booms. We met. One of the things that we learned about October 7th is that the terrorists, the Hamas, had very, very, very good information. We now know that the way that they got that information is that in the last 6 months, Israel increased the number of work permits for people from Gaza. So there were 20,000 workers coming in from Gaza, and Hamas embedded itself into those 20,000 and did surveillance and passed on that surveillance. And so Israel did something, again, let me just play that out for you. Israel does something humanitarian to try to give the people of Gaza a way to make a living. Hamas exploits Israel, Israel doing that. Okay? And Israel is a sovereign nation. It is under no obligation to open a border with another country. Okay? Gaza has a border with Egypt. Okay? If people say it's an open air prison, okay, the people in Gaza can develop a relationship with Egypt. Okay? But Israel has 20,000 workers. They gather the intelligence, and they knew where senior officers in the Israeli military lived. And they went to those houses and they got them first. They either kidnapped them first. We did hear the story about one person who was very high up in intelligence who was able to defend himself, and he killed 15 Hamas terrorists before finally being killed himself. But they had intelligence. They knew where people lived, and they went after specific people who they wanted. And there were a number of people in Kfar Aza who are in Israel's intelligence services, and they knew that. We met a Druze member of in the Israeli army who was filming a video in Arabic in the kibbutz, trying to do explanations for people in the Arabic speaking world about understanding who Hamas is and what, from Israel's perspective, what there were many things that I could describe that I'm not going to, that I saw. One thing that really struck me as I walked by is that I saw in one of the houses, there was a sukkah. Because remember, this all happened at the end of Sukkot. And the sukkah never got taken down. The final place we went was Magen Alumim, with that army base. When I was there, I heard somebody speaking English. We started to play Jewish geography. He grew up in LA. I said, did you ever do anything with Camp Ramah? He said, yeah, I went there for 2 years. I said, okay, how old are you? Wait. He was a camper in the last 2 summers that I was the director. And he's now, what did he say, 27 years old. And he's with the unit there and was going into Gaza. I sat with one of the soldiers. He was 51 years old, so 1 year younger than I am. He's the old man in the unit. And their unit was the first they went to Kfar Aza, because remember, and they got there on Monday. So this all started on Saturday morning. These places were still overrun with terrorists on Monday. The army was doing operation. This guy was in Kfar Aza still. There was some terrorist who came out 2 weeks later, and he just put up his arms and surrendered but he'd been hiding somewhere. These are big places. There were 3,000 of them. His unit had been in Kfar Aza on Monday and then went to Kibbutz Be'eri, which many of you have heard of, which was the site of some of the worst massacres in terms of children. He was there on that Tuesday. They've been at their base, Magen Alumim, and he basically said, I want you to know. He said to me, this was very interesting. He said, I want you to know that I am in the best place in all of Israel and in all of the Jewish world in this military base. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I can do something. He said, I want to be able to do something. And I resonated a lot. For me, it was very strange. One of my experiences of going to Israel was that it was in some ways a relief, because being here, I love you all. I left Durham, and I'm back, and I'm not going anywhere. But being here, I've just been walking around with tremendous anxiety and sadness and depression and worry, and a lot of that we feel all of those things over things that we can't control and that we don't know about. And and a lot of Israelis are experiencing that too, which is why, by the way, a lot of Israelis are just going and doing things, right? One of the places I wrote about this in the email, I visited the Masorti synagogue in Herzliya that has chopped its sanctuary in half and turned the back half of it into a collection thing. And they're doing, the evacuee absorption and support. And it's good to be doing things, right? And he said to me, he's cheering me up. He said, I want to be able. He said, I hate war and I don't love war, of course not, but I feel at home in my heart. The last, I'll share more stories and a final thought. I didn't leave you much time for. I hope I haven't bored you. We went back from the army base. I picked up my bags in Jerusalem, and I got a cab, and the cab driver was Arab, and it was interesting. He just said there's a tremendous sense of sadness over what happened and he said it's, he asked me a little bit about America, and he said there's just nothing normal in Israel, right? It's just, there's no ein shaket, there's no quiet. And I said to him, in some ways, it's most true of Jerusalem. Those of you who spent time in Israel, Jerusalem is sort of the center of shigayon, of sort of a certain level of intensity, right? There's always something. And, when you get out to the periphery, that's another aspect of the horribleness of October 7th, that some people used to describe, the kibbutzim like Kfar Aza as, 98% heaven and 2% hell, right? So the rockets firing on you, okay, that's not a good thing. But the other piece of it, this was heaven. It was idyllic. It was beautiful farmland. There is a very, very beautiful meme that's been going around. One of my teachers, Sagua Masiv, Masua Sagiv, I'm going to be teaching some of her sources on Shabbat after Kiddush. So I'm doing a session on Shabbat after Kiddush, and then also along with Rabbi Safer and Dan and Ari and Sophia on Sunday at 1:30, another session. But on Shabbat after Kiddush, I'm not going to go into this level of detail, but I'm going to share some of the sources that she shared with us as a way. But one of them was this meme. In Hebrew, it says, "Besof nenatzeach ve'od elef shana ye'od chag ze al ze shenisu lahashmin otanu ve'lo hitzlichu ve'haminhag yeh le'echol uviyot Rachel or mashu." So, in order to understand this, you need to know a little bit, not just Hebrew, but also there's a phrase in there, uviyot Rachel. So, who's Rachel? Rachel is this amazing story that's now become legendary in Israel about she's the Israeli grandmother who the terrorists came in, and for whatever reason, like they didn't kill her immediately. They didn't kill her. She survived. And she went Israeli grandmother on them. She said, "You look tired. Do you want some coffee? Do you want to lie down? Do you need some tea? Here, have some cookies." Right, and she just basically took care of these Hamas terrorists in her kitchen for several hours until the army finally came and rescued her and killed them. And so the meme says, "In the end, we will win, and in 1,000 years there will be another holiday about them trying to destroy us, and they failed. And the minhag, the custom of that holiday, will be that we're going to eat Rachel's cookies or something like that." I thought we have to keep some hope for ourselves. So let us all hope that one day they'll make a holiday out of all of this, and we'll eat Rachel's cookies. And let us say Amen. So there's two minutes. I am happy. I mean, not happy, but I can spend another 5 or 10 minutes answering questions and things like that. If you need to go, you're welcome to. But if there are questions that you'd like me to to address or talk about. But before you go, I know you're running out. Let me just remind you that our next Lunch and Learn is December 20th. December 20th. Okay, so hope to. I think it's December 21st, actually. Thursday, December 21st is what I have in my calendar. We'll confirm it, but it is, I believe it's on my calendar, and so I'll. And now you even, I think I know the topic, which is that we'll do just war theory. But for anybody who's on the Zoom, if you want to come off Zoom, I'm happy to try and answer a question, or you can put it in the chat. And anybody here, if you have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. Sheila? Oh, amazing. Amazing. Rabbi Soffer is going to be here for services this evening, 5 p.m. He's on a different trip. Wonderful. Thanks for saying that. Judy.
There's been a recurrent story on the news that a exchange is being considered a 5-day pause for 50 hostages. And I'm wondering if there's been any discussion in Israel, and what is the opinion that you have heard, if you've heard anything about this.
So there, Judy, I'll just repeat it, said that there is there seems to be the possibility of a deal on the table. There are different numbers and different ratios, but it's time, basically a pause in the fighting for the release of a certain number of hostages. The hostages, I think they're looking at women and children, interestingly, maybe not the elderly. So you have to sort of pay attention into like, how do you figure all of this out? The horrible calculations of, you know, who should be first, who should be second. I also met with people who have American, you know, American Israelis, and it's just, you know, there's no outward tension, but, you know, as you can imagine, it's just very strange, right? Because, you know, many of these people have lived in Israel for 30 or 40 years, but they keep American citizenship, and they feel as Israeli as anybody, and yet, because they're Americans, they're going to be moved forward in the line, right? And yet, how can we ask for anything else, right? In terms of the possibilities, I don't know anything, you know, I have no, but in terms of how people are thinking about it, you know, I think that there's a tremendous tension, right? There's a tremendous tension because Israel has two priorities that don't necessarily work with each other. Okay. By the way, notice, right, that for those who are, notice the formula. You know, Hamas is saying we need time. Okay, we want to rest. We want to regroup. Okay, that's what Hamas is asking for. Benny Gantz said, very famous. He said that when you are fighting them, then you have something that they want, right? Which is not fighting, and that becomes a lever in the negotiations. And again, to come back to that question of ceasefire, not ceasefire, you know, you're not dealing with people who are looking to make a deal. But the problem is that Israel faces, you know, the longer that Israel is in Gaza, you know, I don't know, I'm not a military person, but I know enough to say that when you sit somewhere, you become a target. Okay. If Israel, you know, and God forbid, you know, if you know, Bibi is taught Israel, if you sit there, you're going to become a target. You're going to start to become targeted, and you're sacrificing the lives of Israeli soldiers. Okay. If, you know, as somebody, one of these memes said, and I in no way, shape, or form endorse this, but said if this was really a genocide, the war would have been over on October 8th. Right. And we said, you know, there has been massive bombing, but this has been targeted. Okay. And there are real military, you have to clear areas in order to make way, in order to make way for tanks so that you are not. There's a whole science to how all of this happens. But Israel has this military goal of of totally defeating Hamas and getting the hostages. And I do think, generally there's a sense, yeah, we should do something because we want to get babies and children and hostages home. And but these are not strangers, who are fighting this war. From Bethel, you should know there's a kid who had his bar mitzvah at Bethel 10 years ago, who's on the front lines in the north. Right? He's lying there in a field.
I was just wondering, Rabbi, does the Israeli government have a strategy that Hezbollah decides to start unleashing the big rockets?
So, Mary Jones question, does the Israeli government have a strategy if Hezbollah starts releasing rockets? So, first of all, I'm grateful that there's a national government. So I think the war cabinet, has definitely played this out. I think something that's been that we should pay attention to is that the Biden administration, Blinken, it's very unusual for representatives of another country to sit in on meetings of the war cabinet. Okay? And Biden, I believe, I could be wrong about this. I think I read that during Biden's short trip, part of his time was literally sitting with the war cabinet. And I know that Blinken has sat with the war cabinet. So it's an extraordinary level of cooperation. And I think that Israel has a strategy that will, again, this is a larger conflict between Israel and America and the West and Iran. And Hezbollah, Nasrallah gave a very, there was a big speech that happened a week ago, maybe it was longer, a week and a half. Nasrallah basically said, lots and lots of things, bluster. He basically said, we're not entering the war, right? We're going to continue this. It's a small war, right? It's not hot, but it's very warm. There's still Israeli civilians and soldiers who are being killed, and then we're hitting where they come from, but they're not escalating. So if Hezbollah knows also that another piece of this is that Lebanon, in case you didn't hear, is basically suffering like the worst economic crisis of the last 40 years. They don't have electricity. Lebanon is very, very, very weak, and rightfully so. Israel will hold the state of Lebanon, the country of Lebanon, responsible. It should hold them. The truth is that Israel has, bellis casus, or however you say that in Latin term. What is it? Casus belli? Casus belli. It has casus belli right now to start hitting Beirut. Okay, when you start sending rockets and and stuff, and there's 100,000 people from the north who've been forced to leave because of the level of rocket fire. Okay, Israel has exercised restraint, in not holding the rest of Lebanon responsible. Hezbollah knows that if they increase, then they are going to, that Lebanon is going to pay the price, and they will have, the Lebanese are going to need to basically rise up against Hezbollah. And Iran is pulling a lot of these strings because Iran also knows that there are 2 aircraft carriers. The problem is, one other thing, and I'll finish with this, that Yossi Klein Halevi said, and I'm not saying everything he says is right or whatever, just throw it out there as something to think about. Everybody can, but he said that America's credibility in the Middle East was lost when Obama didn't the red line. Okay, if you remember during Obama's presidency, he said the red line is that if Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, then America will strike back. And they did, and we didn't. And he said that was the beginning of an incredible loss of American credibility. And that the question right now is, yes, Biden sent 2 aircraft carriers, but does Iran think that we're going to use them? Right? And it's not clear. It's not clear. He's been very strong, but and if you don't have the credibility, then and again, I don't know all of this stuff. It's all very complicated, but there are people who say that you're inviting, all of this is just inviting Hezbollah to do more and more, right? And again, I will remind you, I said this at the beginning, this is not, it cannot finish, right? It can't finish with the status quo in the north right now, okay? And so when Gantz says that this is lasting a year, right? And he's just talking about Gaza, right? But Israel cannot have 250,000 people who are unable to live within its rightful borders, right? Can't happen. And one of the things that Yossi Klein Halevi said is, even if you can, right? Even if the long-term viability of the Jewish state is this is a place where Jews can come and feel safe. And existentially, if Israel cedes that territory, they may be able to, on paper, survive for a certain amount of time, but long term, it will be the argument is it will be an existential blow to the state if Israel partially wins this war with Hamas or even with Hezbollah. I promised, but Martha, I love you. Just ask me the question and I'll be really fast. Let's take two more. Yeah.
The war having been concerned about what's going on in the West Bank, that was burning houses and killing Palestinians. I mean, that helped us.
All right, so let me, and then yes, one more.
And first of all, Rabbi, thank you. So many people find myself trying to explain to those people around the world. You have any ideas? I want to say
okay. So I'm going to repeat the two questions for people on Zoom, and then I'm going to actually try and be short. So one question about what's happening on the West Bank, and sort of fueling worldwide anti-Semitism. I mean, I am going to separate the two things. I don't think that the worldwide anti-Semitism has. Rabbi Wolpe once said, anti-Semitism is not about the victim. Okay, in other words, I don't think that we're experiencing anti-Semitism because of awful things happening in the West Bank. I think we're experiencing anti-Semitism because people hate Jews. And let me just say, in a very full-throated way, what's happening in the West Bank is a moral and utter disaster. I mean, it's horrific. And by the way, part of what Israel is going to figure out is one of the things that's out there is that where was the army? And the answer is the army was on the West Bank. Right. And it's one of the reasons why people are absolutely furious with this government. This government, and I talked about this when it was in power, the government, and I talked about it explicitly on Rosh Hashanah, and I had somebody walk out at me, right? It's my first time, right? I had an Israeli walk out at me, but I was very full-throated, right? The government, this government has been an utter disaster. And what's happening in the West Bank is a desecration of God's name. It's horrific. And there needs to be first of all, there needs to be a will to have settlers obey the rule of law and to prosecute them and to put them in jail and to punish them for those things. And I don't think, number one, there's the will, okay, and I'm not excusing it, but right now it's also pretty low on the priority list, right? Israel's army is elsewhere, although there's a lot of unrest in the West Bank also, right? It's one of the reasons.
Any concerns about what's going on there at all?
I mean, I think that the question was, did they have any? And it's just not what people are thinking about right now. I mean, what I said as Shiva, I really mean it. The state of Israel, there is a sense of loss and real focus on evacuees and on the war and on supporting, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of, I mean, I talked about some of this a month ago. Wasn't I here? Was I here after this happened? Since October 7th? I was, right? And what? It was within a week or two. And so I'm going to just say two things. Number one, I have my, I have a kippah, I have my ribbon. As I showed on the news the other night, I have my bring them home. I have a yellow band on my car, right? That's what they're doing in Israel, the yellow bands, like we did with the Iran hostage. Be who you are, okay? I don't think if there are people, you have to evaluate, is this somebody who I care about? And if it's somebody who I care about, we're going to talk about it, right? And don't apologize for being Jewish. Don't apologize for loving the state of Israel. And we should be proud of who we are. And I was sad not to be able to be there with 290,000 other Jews in DC, but it was a very important moment. And in terms of the media, we do have to practice self-care, take care of yourself, and right, talk to your politicians and talk to the media, right, and complain and tell them this is a problem, et cetera, right? But believe me, the political will, okay. Oh, I forgot to tell you one of the but the political will is going to be a real issue, and it's coming to a head right now. Next time, in the next session, we're going to talk about just war theory, okay? But I want to tell you something because it's very relevant in the news right now. The Sheba Hospital, okay, is the biggest problem that you can have in just war theory. Okay? Proportionality in just war theory means, is the military advantage that's gained by getting rid of this target outweighed by the collateral damage in the getting rid of the target? And Hamas, all of Gaza and Hamas has made this an utter, totally immoral, et cetera, et cetera. But the Sheba Hospital is literally the pinnacle of that. You have a hospital, okay, a hospital that has become a place where people have been fleeing for safety, built on top of a huge military target, okay, that whole hospital complex. And one question that Yossi brought up is Biden's support for Israel going to survive what happens? And that's why Biden has been very particular about what Israel does. He's trying to be a good friend, right? Very particular. Israel, under just war theory, might have a case that it could just take out the Sheba Hospital. Okay, but from a moral perspective and also, but from a strategic perspective, they're not going to do that because Israel, yes, they can go at it on their own, but they do depend on the United States for resupply. Okay, they're a small country. They don't have unlimited storage of ammunition, and they need the American. The strategic alliance means a tremendous amount, right? So, that's all to come back to. Yes, have your conversations and take care of yourself, and involve yourself in the political process. Okay, and I mean that very, very seriously. There's a lot of phone calls, a lot of, in addition to all of the just humanitarian support that's needed in Israel, and at some point the reconstruction of Gaza as well. Thank you. I wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Thanks everybody online for coming. I'm going to end the session. Take care.